Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 29th of April, where I wanted to talk about persuasive speeches as well as argumentation and critical thinking, chapter 13 and chapter 14. That'll pretty much put closure onto the major parts of the textbook. And these chapters will help prepare us for our third and final speech. So congratulations for finishing speech 2, and I will be getting your feedback to you very soon. And do remember to send me your outline for speech number 2 via PDF to my email at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I also wanted to review dates because, believe it or not, we are nearing the ending of the semester. So you can see in the notes below that what we have scheduled for Tuesday, which is the 4th of May, believe it or not, is our third quiz. And that will cover chapters 6, 11, and 12. And that's what was scheduled on our outline. So we'll continue following the outline in that respect. It'll be similar to the first 2 quizzes, 20 questions, a combination of short answer, multiple choice, true, false, open book, open notes. You have 24 hours in which to take the examination and to send it to my email at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And also, I would ask you to contact me to schedule some sort of a practice for your third and final speech. Whether you want to do that via email, or you want to do that via telephone, or you want to do that via Zoom, or you want to do that with some combination thereof. So basically, very similar to what we've been doing thus far. Because our class is a little bit smaller than it was when we began during the semester, I can slow us down a little bit more. Rather than have 2 classes devoted to the persuasive speech, we can have 1 class devoted to the persuasive speech. And that means that on the 6th of May, rather than delivering the persuasive speech, what I can do is have you view and respond to a student sample speech. And that means that you will have basically, outside of watching that speech and responding to it via your class attendance question, the rest of the time to basically prepare for your persuasive speech, which will be the following class, and to have some sort of a connection with me about your third and final speech. So speech number 3 will be delivered on the 11th of May, and that's a Tuesday, and you can upload that much like you've been uploading your previous speeches. So if you think you do want to present live via Zoom, please contact me so that we can set up a time in which you can do that on the 11th. And that leaves 1 final class, and that is the 13th, where you would be taking your 4th and final quiz. Do note that I drop the lowest quiz grade, so it could be that at that point you might elect to not take quiz 4 and drop that grade if you'd like to. What you would have left then on the 13th is just to watch the persuasive speeches of your peers and to give a strength and weakness for the attendance question, much like you did with speech 1, and I'm going to ask you to do today with speech 2. So your last speech, the persuasive speech, is 15 minutes. So you can see that the speeches have been increasing in length over the course of the semester. This speech is asking you to use 3 outside sources. So to use outside references. You don't necessarily have to use an audio or visual, though you certainly can elect to use an audio visual, but you are required to use outside sources. And I know that some of you used outside sources for your second informative speech, but you weren't necessarily required to. For this speech, you are required to. So you've got your 3 outside sources, and we talked a little bit about using the library, and I encourage you to use the GCC library. If you are using just the open web, you need to be careful that you're verifying your sources and that you are using valid sources. And I don't necessarily care what the makeup is of the sources that you happen to use. So you could use 3 websites if you wanted to. You could use 3 books, or a book and a website and a magazine article. There are any number of permutations and combinations that you could use with your websites or with your outside sources. And that also includes interviews, which I had talked about last class, that you could interview somebody who has a certain level of expertise in the subject, assuming that, again, they have expertise in the subject and you've gotten permission to interview them and permission to use their information in your speech, and that would count as a source. So things like videos and so forth would also count as outside sources. I ask that you document where those sources are coming from. I stopped counting after the third source, so you could use as many sources as you like, but the minimum is 3. And if you could just document those sources on the outline, the speaking outline that you are going to be submitting into me via email, just at the ending of the outline, just list your sources just so I could take a quick peek at it. And I'm not necessarily looking for you to cite those sources in any particular format. It doesn't have to be, let's say, an MLA as opposed to APA. Just as long as you've got the major pieces of information, the author and the date of publication, the publisher, and things of that nature. So, the persuasive speech has to be about a topic that can be debated. It's more than just a fact, something that can be proven. It's something that is based somewhat in opinion, something that reasonable people could debate about or could disagree about. Usually it's a good technique to talk about the opposing side, albeit briefly, and refute the opposing side if possible. In other words, talk about some of the ways that your position is stronger than the other position. Outside sources help to enhance credibility, and that's one of the reasons why you're using outside sources, because you want to have as much credibility as possible, especially because you are talking about people's belief structures and their values, and oftentimes those can be very firmly embedded into an individual. So regardless of the quality of your speech, they may be so firmly embedded in their value system that they aren't going to change their position, and I believe that's fine. I think ultimately what you want to do is not have everybody in the audience agree with you. I think that's unrealistic. I think you want everybody in the audience to respect you, and that's different. You can respect somebody and their presentation and still not necessarily agree with their particular position. And it's something I wish that we could do more of, especially in the political world. So, how do you motivate individuals to want to support your particular position or to want to support a particular action? And I'm not sure which is more difficult. Sometimes it's more difficult to get people to act. For instance, you can give speeches about the importance of eating well and exercising. Most people will agree with you, but it will be difficult to get people to actually incorporate that behavior into their lifestyles. So that's something that you need to consider, is how are you actually going to get people to change their behavior? Because that's the real challenge. Other times, it's easier to get people to change their behavior, but not necessarily to change their belief systems. So I might get you to sign a petition just because you want me to go away, let's say. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the petition you're signing in any way reflects your belief structure. Or perhaps you believe that it would be politically advantageous for you to be seen signing this petition, but again, that doesn't necessarily reflect your belief structure. So it depends on what your topic is. And you get the choice of choosing a topic that can be highly controversial. And you know what those subjects are, those hot button subjects that oftentimes are the divisive subjects in politics, things like abortion and gun control. But then again, you can talk about subjects that aren't terribly controversial either, such as, increasing exercise or improving diet. Think a little bit about what's happening in the news. Think a little bit about what's happening in your life. You probably, throughout a day, multiple times, talk about how you wish something was different. That could very easily be turned into a persuasive speech. For instance, there should be a traffic light at this intersection. And also, you can think about former writings that you've done in the past. Chances are good that you might have written a persuasive paper in an English class that perhaps can be adapted for public speaking. Think about the kinds of topics that you talk about at the dinner table with family and friends. Oftentimes, those can be persuasive topics. So, how to encourage individuals to support your position or to support or to engage in a particular action. This is not a very easy thing to do. It's not an exact science, but generally speaking, there are 3 ways to motivate people. And again, understand this is an oversimplification. The first is affiliation or belonging. You can see this in the notes below. People want to belong. We want to be part of the tribe. We want to be part of the group. That's why number 1 products are so appealing. The idea is that, well, if everybody else is buying it, I want to buy it too. I want to be like everybody else. Achievement or success is a great motivator. Look at television commercials. Oftentimes car commercials, especially for luxury vehicles, will oftentimes be associated with other images associated with success. Large houses, for instance, the person driving up to a very large house. The assumption is that if they can afford the luxury vehicle, they can also afford the home or the mansion that goes with the luxury vehicle. And power. People want to have a certain level of control in their lives. And again, power is something that you can see in television commercials. Car commercials are a great example as well. That you might not necessarily have power in your personal or professional life, but behind the wheel of your vehicle, that's your environment and you get to control it completely. And again, if you're talking about the number one vehicle in America, then perhaps that would be the affiliation or belonging motivational appeal. So you can mix and match these appeals. There is one appeal that is particularly effective, but it also is particularly dangerous, and that's the use of fear. And you've probably seen this used not only in commercials, that if you don't use the right deodorant, no one is going to want to date you, let's say. But you've probably seen this used in the media as well, especially for social and political issues. You need to use fear cautiously because it can interfere with reasoning. People become so afraid that they can no longer think. So you need to think carefully about if you're going to use fear, and if so, how. So, the idea of talking about cancer studies associated with smoking, well, this is obviously the use of fear to try to scare someone not to smoke. And you might say, in this instance, the ends justify the means. But, of course, we know how oftentimes fear is used excessively. Oftentimes it's associated with weather patterns when we're told if this new storm is coming and will it be devastating. And then we click on it. Sometimes that's known as clickbait. When we click on the link and we find out that they're referencing a storm that has already passed, one that was several years ago. But again, they were able to inspire a certain level of fear, or perhaps, urging us to go to the store and stock up on supplies. Again, our fear motivating us in the event that the storm is so horrible that we aren't going to be able to purchase supplies during or after the storm. Now, there's a theorist by the name of Monroe who came up with a motivated sequence of how it is that we can encourage individuals to support a particular belief structure or support a particular behavior. And honestly, it's something we've been talking about all semester long in one way or another. The first is attention. You need to get your audience's attention. The second is need. You need to show that there's some sort of need for a change in behavior or a change in a belief system. Then satisfaction. The assumption is that your speech is going to show that through your argumentation, through your advice and your position and perspective, you can satisfy or at least help reduce some of the negatives associated with whatever need exists. Visualization, any kind of way that you can use imagery to visualize, to allow the audience to visualize what a future might look with your recommendations. And then finally, if you want an audience to take a particular kind of action, sign a petition, donate money, whatever the case may happen to be, you may or may not necessarily want that. Now, how are you going to do this? You're going to do this through argumentation. And what that means is that you have a claim. In other words, you're taking a position on an element that can be considered to be debatable. Reasonable people can disagree about it. And your claim is supported by evidence, such as outside sources, and also reasoning patterns, ways to determine how to go about thinking about the issue. Now, you can have lots of different claims. You can have a claim of fact, but just because it's a claim of fact, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be debated. And I gave an example of this in the notes below, when you're talking about that something is or is not the case. For instance, GCC is a small school, is a claim of fact. But in reference to what? And if we were talking about a school of just dozens of people, then GCC would be a very large school. Or how about a claim of value, that something is good or bad? And that oftentimes is subjective and opinion-based. How about GCC is a good school? And the question is, how do you measure that? Do you measure that through test scores? Do you measure that through interviews? How do we evaluate that? How do we assess that? And a claim of policy, taking a course of action. Again, I'll use GCC again. GCC should reestablish a sports program. And by the way, GCC used to have a sports program, but it was eliminated as a cost-cutting measure. And then, of course, you could argue that we've lost more than what we would have gained if we had retained our sports program, because we might have been able to attract more enrollment. But we don't know unless we actually retain the program and could actually test that. So you can see how tricky these things get when you're making a claim of policy or course of action. And so you take that course of action, you don't necessarily know what the result will be. And you don't necessarily know if you can separate cause and effect so that it's very clear that your cause of action is the reason why you ended up with the particular result. In terms of reasoning patterns, the process you use to reason, you can use inductive reasoning. In other words, gather multiple examples. This is oftentimes what's done in medical studies, where they use example after example to prove something like, let's say, the safety of a vaccination. You can use deductive reasoning, which means a generalization after you have done your inductive reasoning. So after multiple examples about the safety of the COVID-19 vaccination, then you can generalize that the COVID vaccination is safe. The example I gave you for deductive reasoning, the generalization is that college leads to success, which is usually true, but it isn't always necessarily the case. Or reasoning from sign, there's some sort of observable mark that leads you to draw a conclusion. So for instance, if you were to get a sore throat, you could conclude, because of all of the times this has happened previously and the generalization you've made from that a sore throat means that you've got a head cold. It may not be completely obvious, or it may not be completely true, but there's a very high probability that that's what the case is. That said, we make errors in reasoning all of the time, certainly when we have conversations with other individuals. And we want to be very careful to try to avoid errors in reasoning when we are putting together formal academic arguments, whether in writing or in public speaking. And we also want to be very careful when we are reading and listening to arguments, that we are evaluating them to make sure that there aren't any errors in reasoning. And I've listed just a couple in the notes, or just a few in the notes below. For instance, a hasty generalization. There's too little evidence in order to be able to draw a conclusion. For instance, you might say that a particular class has been offered for the past few semesters and it's been canceled because of low enrollment. We could make a hasty generalization and say that that class is not popular. But is that the case? Does it have is there another reason for that? Could it be the time in which the class is being offered, or the instructor who is teaching the class? There could be a number of variables outside of the actual class itself. So hasty generalizations when there's too little evidence in order to draw a conclusion. Or an appeal to ignorance, what we don't know. In other words, the burden of proof is not on the speaker or the writer. The burden of proof is on the audience or the reader. In other words, I could basically state something to the effect of, I'm a space alien from Mars, and until you can prove that I'm not, I obviously am. And this is problematic because the burden of proof should be on me, not necessarily on you as audience. The bandwagon fallacy, join the crowd. This is part of the idea of the affiliation motive, that we all want to belong. I call this the teenage argument. Just because everybody else is going to the party, you want to go to the party too. Sequential fallacy, which I was referencing earlier, cause and effect. We can't necessarily assume that cause and effect are linked together. There could be outside variables that are influencing things. Begging the question, which is just rephrasing the question. For instance, if I were to ask you something like, what is critical thinking? And your response is, it's thinking critically. That is begging the question. All you've done is you've rephrased the question. Or if I were to ask you, what is emphatic listening? Or empathetic, what is empathetic listening? And you responded by saying it's listening with empathy. That is begging the question. You're just rephrasing the question rather than defining empathy, which is emotionally supportive listening. Appeal to authority sounds like it wouldn't be an error in reasoning, but it is. This is something where the authority really isn't an authority in the area, but just happens to be popular. A celebrity, for instance. Think about a celebrity endorsement for a product. Let's say a sports figure that happens to be endorsing, let's say, a particular cell phone service. Um, while the sports figure is popular, their profession and their experiences have nothing to do with cell phones. So if they were endorsing something that was related to sports, well, then there would be an obvious connection there and there would be an authority. But in this instance, they wouldn't be an authority. The idea is that, well, we admire the sports figure or the entertainer, and therefore we want to engage in the same sort of behaviors and purchase the same sort of products. And name calling, the attack on the individual, which I think all of us know that we shouldn't do. I call this the elementary school yard sort of attack. And sometimes it's the school of true life that is a better teacher than anything you could find in a textbook. Because I have an example of name calling, and you can see that I've included a link to the article that talks about it, as well as a brief video. And I can give you a little bit of background information here. This was several years ago during a college debate between two schools. So these were two debate teams, and with their debate advisors, the professors. Now, you probably are thinking that things got heated during the debate between the teams. That's not what happened. Things got heated in the debate between the professors, the coaches. And they had some bad blood between them. They had argued before. And the debate topic was very controversial. It was about race. One of the coaches was Caucasian male. The other coach was a black female. So there was that tension that was already in there. But what ended up happening is that both of these debate coaches ended up screaming profanities at one another. It had something to do with the way that scoring was done as they were scoring each debate team. The one of the professors, the Caucasian male, actually dropped his pants and mooned the other professor. As I'm fond of saying, you can't make this stuff up. He was still wearing underwear though, so I guess we could debate whether or not that was a true mooning. The situation ended with several students in tears. And none of this was supposed to be filmed, but we do live in an era of cell phones. So it was filmed, it was put online, it did go viral. And the response of it was that one of the professors was fired and the other was put on probation. And again, we could debate whether those were just punishments and how those punishments were meted out and which school made what decision. I'm much less interested in all of that, as well as I'm much less interested in the subject matter that they were arguing about. What I am interested in is that two people who are highly skilled and professional in communication and public speaking, basically in a moment of emotion, completely lost it, which goes to show how easy it is to engage in an error in reasoning and to try to keep your emotions in check when you are talking about persuasive subjects, and to keep your emotions in check when you are listening to persuasive subjects. So I want you to read that article, which talks a little bit about the situation, as well as see that brief video, which these professors have tried to remove numerous times from the internet. And let that be a lesson to you, that once there is an electronic footprint, it's very difficult to remove. So at least at the time of my posting, this link was live so that you could see a piece of their argument, but it is a much longer argument. And I think that's a great example, not just of name calling as they are attacking each other as individuals, but also a great example of how emotion can get in the way of reason and rationality. So for today's attendance question, I wanted to give you an extended deadline to respond to that. I wanted you to review your classmates' speeches of speech number 2, the informative speech, and to send me via my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, one strength and one weakness for each of your peers for speech number 2. And I'm going to ask you to just submit that in by Sunday. So you've got up until the weekend to do that, because we've got longer speeches here. So you might need additional time. And I certainly don't have any problem with giving you additional time, because I will gather all of this together and I will post that on Tuesday so that you can read the feedback for yourself from your peers. And also you can read the feedback from your from the other speeches as well. So you've got up until Sunday, the 2nd of May, 11:59 p.m. to submit that. I'll gather all of that together on Monday and post that on Tuesday along with your third quiz. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And please contact me about how you would like to talk about your third and final speech, your persuasive speech. Take care. Bye-bye.